Okay, so welcome to our one of our lessons in Black History Week, and it's the road to civil rights. So what you see right now on the screen is the same article that is in today's folder. I'm just going to read through it, and then when I'm done reading, I'm going to go through the question sheet. So if you wanted help with that, please stay tuned for that. So the road to civil rights, isn't that discrimination? Discrimination happens when one person is treated differently from another. Segregation happens when one group is kept separate from another group. Both of these happen when there is prejudice or intolerance. You will often hear these words when people talk about the way African Americans have been treated in our country. We shall overcome. African Americans and others have always resisted prejudice, but the Jim Crow laws that allowed legal discrimination against African Americans might still exist today if it wasn't for the hard work of people in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. During that time, people joined together, organized, and protested more than ever before. New laws were passed, other laws were declared unconstitutional, and things started to change in people's everyday lives. I'm going to pause for a second and look at these two images on here. If you've never seen these types of images before, let me explain. This one's a little hard to see, so I'll explain it. So this one says separate drinking fountains for colored and white people. So people were classified in one of two groups regardless of their heritage and culture. So somebody from Mexico, somebody from Argentina, somebody from anywhere that their skin appeared to be anything darker than very white was considered colored and would drink from this water fountain. So it was to separate white and black people, but also white and anybody other than white. So there was a consequence in some places of if you were a colored skin person drinking from the white water fountain, that could be an arrestable offense in certain parts of the United States. So that's what this is, a segregated water fountain. This photo down here says it's a non-violent sit-in at a whites-only lunch counter in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So we don't really have lunch counters anymore, but if you can imagine like stores like Walgreens and CVS used to have a restaurant inside of them. So you would sit on a stool right here and there would be a person working back here where the stove and everything was making food and serving it to you like restaurant. So these were white only restaurants, and in order to protest, some black citizens would come in and sit, not cause any trouble, not try to be violent, not be rude, nothing, just sit and ask to be served like the white customers were being served. So this was a way to protest in a non-violent way, but to ask for respect and to be given service so that they could buy a meal like anybody else. The people who changed things, civil rights movers and shakers. The civil rights movement was made up of many well-known people, as well as political groups and ordinary citizens. They all stood up to intimidation, violence, and threat of arrest. Even kids got involved. So these words are all sort of relatable to bullying. So in order to be one of these people to come and sit at these lunch counters and demand service in a very peaceful way, you really had to be willing to put up with a whole lot of meanness and the other customers being mean and the people working there possibly being mean and saying hurtful things and throwing things at you and spilling food on you. It was really something that took a lot of courage to be able to participate in. Martin Luther King Jr. helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is going to be called the SCLC for the rest of the article. He delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist who investigated cases for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, or the NAACP, and helped James Meredith integrate the University of Mississippi. I accidentally skipped over Malcolm X. Malcolm X promoted Black independence, self-defense, and human rights. He often disagreed with the nonviolent methods of King. So although they were both wanting the same outcome, which was equality for all people, they had different ways of doing it. The Little Rock Nine integrated their all-white high school in 1957. A third grader named Linda Brown helped change the laws about school segregation. So we will touch on Linda Brown's case later in the week, and some of these other things you will get in upper grades. We've talked about Martin Luther King this year as well. Change starts with forcing people to pay attention. Activists used a variety of strategies to end racial discrimination. Like Martin Luther King Jr., many activists chose to use peaceful or nonviolent methods to call attention to the problem and pressure the government to change. Other people, like Malcolm X, thought civil rights would have to be gained through any means necessary, even violence. Both approaches influenced the civil rights movement by calling attention to the discrimination African Americans faced on a daily basis. And there's some other key words over here. Marches. involved large groups of protesters taking to the streets with signs, banners, songs, and chants. Sit-ins were a way to integrate, and that word means bring the races together, in a business or public area. African Americans would sit at whites-only areas and wait to be served. Boycotts called for consumers to avoid a product or service that discriminated against African Americans. And court cases, which we will look at one this week, challenged unfair laws. The road to civil rights. It took the change in the White House. It took the work of all three branches to finally protect the civil rights of African Americans and other minority groups in the United States. As the leader of the nation and the executive branch, the president holds an important role in bringing about change. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy asked for legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. He was assassinated that same year, but the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, helped push the bill through Congress. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. Both men used their power and influence to enforce major political and social change. Change in the laws. Other changes came about when new laws were passed through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, and national origin. This includes discrimination in the workplace, public places, school, and in voting. The 24th Amendment ended the practice of poll taxes in 1964. States and local governments could no longer charge citizens for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits any restriction on the right to vote. This includes poll tests and voter intimidation. It followed through on the promise of the 15th Amendment. Change in the courts. Many changes came when the Jim Crow laws that limited the freedoms and rights of African Americans were challenged in the courts. Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Bailey versus Patterson. In 1962, the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional for transportation facilities like buses and train stations to be racially segregated. Loving versus Virginia. In 1967, the Supreme Court decided that any state law that prohibits interracial marriage is unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall, there's a picture over here. He was the attorney who represented the Brown family. So when you see Brown versus the Board of Education, Brown refers to Linda Brown, the little girl who was involved in that case, which we will learn about later this week. He became the first African American justice on the Supreme Court in 1967, so after he was their lawyer. Did anyone oppose the civil rights movement? And the answer is yes, sadly. There were many different groups that fought the changes brought on by the civil rights movement. In politics, a group called the Dixiecrats worked to keep racial segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. Many Southern towns had white citizen councils that also fought to keep segregation by creating all-white schools and pushing Black civil rights activists out of jobs. The most well-known group was the Ku Klux Klan, which met secretly and was responsible for acts of violence and terrorism against African Americans and white people who supported the fight for civil rights. These groups and others made even speaking out a very dangerous activity. So I'm going to stop the video here, and the next video will be me going through the answers with you and talking you through the fill in the blank part of this civil rights lesson.